Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started for this evening. So my name is Andrew Felton. I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and tonight I am joined by Rebecca Golden. Hi, Rebecca, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So tonight's webinar is going to be about living with leafcutter bees. So we'll be exploring a little bit about the world of leafcutter bees. Just to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording tonight's presentations and we will upload it onto our YouTube channel sometime in the next day or two. Everyone who has registered for tonight's presentation will receive a follow-up email that will contain a link to that recording, as well as a copy of the presentation slides that you'll be seeing tonight, and also some links to any resources that we discuss throughout the evening. At the very end of, if you do need to step away, feel free to do so, and you can watch that recording in just at your convenience. At the end of tonight's presentation, there will be a pop-up that will come up for a workshop evaluation form. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple of moments at the end and just providing us with a bit of feedback, that better enables us to cater these future webinars to any of the needs that you have, so we can offer new and better options for you. Anyone who lives within Washington County, if you do complete one of those survey evaluations, you are able to request some pollinator resources in the form of a booklets that we can mail directly to you. And there'll be more information about that in the survey itself. So just to go over the format, I'm going to do a brief introduction to the Soil and Water Conservation District. And then I will hand it over to Rebecca for her presentation on leafcutter bees. And then at the very end, we'll have time for questions at the end of the presentation. At the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. If you have any questions along the way, feel free just to click on that icon and you can add your questions at any time, and we'll read all of them out at the very end. Also, we had a couple of questions come in when folks registered, so we'll make sure to cover those during that Q&A session. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Alrighty, so a little bit about the Tualatin SWCD. So Tualatin SWCD is one of the 45 soil and water conservation districts in the state of Oregon. Our service area is Washington County, which is just right outside of the Portland metro region. If you don't live in our service area in Washington County, that's quite all right. But I do really want to encourage you to look up to see who your local SWCD is, because oftentimes many of them provide many of the same services that we do. And that's not just in Oregon, that's also across anywhere in the United States. Just about every county in the US has a soil and water conservation district associated with it. Now, what do? As Soil and Water Conservation District, we work with residents to help implement conservation actions to conserve our natural resources like wildlife, soil, water, you name it. And we do that by doing three different things. We do that through technical assistance. So we offer advice, we provide site visits. So if you have a question about anything natural resource related, feel free to reach on out and ask us. We also do that through financial assistance. We offer grants, direct payments for qualifying projects, things along those lines. And we also do that through education programs, through events just like the one you're attending today. Now, where do SWCDs come from? Soil and water conservation districts originated after the 1930s, after a natural disaster called the Dust Bowl. In the years leading up to the Dust Bowl, deep plowing was a common practice, and deep plowing really upends a lot of plant roots, and that created loose soil on top of the ground. Now, as drought hit and winds picked up, that loose soil took to the sky and created black blizzards, essentially, that enveloped much of the Midwest and the East Coast. And because as a result of that, the US really started to look into its farming practice and wanted to create an organization that can provide better reference to residents and farmers in particular at the time, how they can better care for their land through their communities. So they created the Soil Conservation Service. Today, that's what SWCDs are named after. And even our principles are the same as they were from all the way back then. So our founding principles are that we're local, we work with our local communities, we're non-regulatory, so we don't have any regulatory action, we don't provide fines, we're just here to provide advice, and we are responsible for our entire community. Originally, that was just for farmers. These days, we work with anyone in the community. So that's urban residents, forest residents, agriculture residents, you name it. And because of that, we like to say that we work on a watershed scale. Now, what is a watershed? A watershed is a plot of land that essentially, that the contours of it form a bowl or a basin. This illustration here is of the Tualatin River watershed, which is Washington County. So this is our watershed, our service area that we work in. And as you can see from the illustration, the mountains that surround our valley form that bowl or basin. So any water that falls on it, flows through it, flows on top of it, and touches everything within our community. And for that reason is why we say that we work on a watershed level. Now here in Washington County, we have about 50% agricultural land, about 35%, about 50% forested land, 35% agricultural land, and then another 15% that's in urban territory. But no matter where you are within our watershed, that water touches any one of those land uses. And so we try to work with anyone within our community to help improve the health of our watershed. Now, how do leafcutter bees fit into that? Well, leafcutter bees are pollinators, and pollinators are essential for a healthy watershed because pollinators help native plants grow. Now, native plants are important because they are adapted to local climates, so they grow better within our local climates, meaning they can provide better habitat for other wildlife, including the pollinators that we'll be learning about today, but also many other species that call our region home. Native plants also grow deeper roots so they can hold on to that soil better so we don't have those black blizzards. They also help hold the soil in place so we don't have any erosion that can happen within our rivers, creeks, streams, you name it. Because native plants are adapted to our region, they don't require the use of any pesticides or fertilizers, which can also result in pollution happening within our waterways. And for that reason, they're important, and they're something that we want to provide as many resources as we can so that they can thrive. And providing habitat and learning about many of the pollinators that help them is one of the best ways that we can do that. So with that, I will hand it over to Rebecca, and we can learn a little bit more about leafcutter bees tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right, so as mentioned, today we will be mostly discussing leafcutter bees, which is a specific group of bees that we can provide habitat for and actually manage so that we can increase their populations in urban areas. And specifically, you can keep them in urban, suburban habitats and smaller habitats, and you can also scale this up as a pollination habitat for agricultural fields. So we're going to start very basic about bees themselves, and we're going to kind of zero in a little bit more in detail about their biology so that we can understand what they need from us. And so a bee is a bee for a few different reasons, and that mostly depends on its phylogeny and its diet. So its phylogeny, what I mean by that is that they are insects. So going back to grammar school, that means they have 6 legs, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and they're closely related to wasps and ants. So they're all in the same insect order, Hymenoptera, where they share a very similar DNA blueprint to one another. And wasps were some of the first insects that would visit flowers to gather nectar. And nectar is a carbohydrate source or an energy source that fuels a lot of their flight and a lot of their activity. But when it comes to protein and what they were feeding their young, they were mostly gathering, hunting for other insects and finding prey. And somewhere along the line, they developed the ability to eat pollen as their protein source. So it was this kind of one-stop shop. They land on a flower, they gather nectar, and then gather pollen then to bring back to feed their young. And it's from that one wasp ancestor that all bees have diverged. So we've got their phylogeny, they're closely related to insects, or they're closely related to wasps and ants, they're insects, and their diet. So they get all of their food from flowers. They're florivores that gather sugars from nectar and then proteins from pollen to feed their young. And so as a result of wanting to gather that protein, that pollen source, they developed a bunch of different morphological characteristics like long hairs or widened back legs with little divots in them that they could pack pollen into. And so these external characteristics that grab onto pollen on the outsides of their bodies make them really, really amazing pollinators. And so they're grabbing onto that pollen mostly to bring back to their nest, and that's what they'll feed their young. But in the process, as they're flying from flower to flower, they're really spreading a lot of those pollen grains around between flowers. And those pollen grains are actually the male genetic material of the plant itself. And so they're spreading that male genetic material to the female parts of the next flower, and that allows it to fertilize the egg in the plant to produce seeds and fruit. And beyond that, bees are super diverse. And so I know a lot of the things that we generally associate with bees, or I just played a word association game with a group of second graders, and a lot of it is sting and honey and queen, but those really are only specific to one species of bee we have here in North America, the honeybee. But we've got about 4,000 species of native bee in North America. And of those, most of them are solitary with just a single female living in the ground. They come in a diverse range of sizes and colors. They have a lot of different nesting strategies, a lot of different social strategies, but they're all just grouped together by their genetic relation to one another, and then by their diet. So how they're gathering their food, which comes entirely from flowers. And so you'll hear me talk about native bees a lot today. And so I mentioned there are 4,000 species of bee in North America, and about 500 of those bees are in Oregon alone. And when I say native bee, that means it's a bee species that's indigenous to a particular ecoregion. And so they weren't moved there by humans for some reason. And of those species, about 90% of them are solitary. So that means it's just a single female taking care of a nest of her own. Most of those will nest in the ground. And so they'll find often slopes that have a little bit of ground cover, maybe natural ground cover like wild strawberry, for instance, or thyme, where they'll dig little sandy tunnels, and that's where they will provision their nests. Of those, all of them are pretty non-defensive. And so that's all female bees do have a stinger and have the ability to sting, but most of them will not act defensively towards humans because that's a losing battle. Whereas in the case of a honeybee, you've got thousands of individuals, and some of them are more expendable. And that's not necessarily the case for most native bees that we have. And as a result of how they're gathering their food, all bees really do play at least some role in pollination. And our native bees are the best bees for pollinating our native plants. And that native plant ecosystem that we have here is really what's important to protect for both our water quality and our soil health. And so in the context of a soil and water conservation in your watershed, these are the bees that are most important to provide habitat for and to protect. Okay, And there are a lot of non-native bee species that we have here in North America and in Oregon. So the most famous of those is the European honeybee that were brought over from Europe in the 1600s as producers of honey and beeswax, but they've now been co-opted to provide a lot of our agricultural pollination. So the way we do it now, we have these huge crop fields. We have big ag where they have large monocultures that are producing a huge amount of just one type of food crop that only blooms for a short period of the year. And so that requires trucking in honey beehives to do these mass pollination events, because since only one type of plant is blooming for a short period of the year, it's a food desert the rest of the time, and it takes up a lot of the habitat for the native bees that would otherwise live there. And there are many other unintentionally introduced bee species, and sometimes introduced on purpose. And so this one here, we have Bombus impatiens. It's a bumblebee that is native to the eastern states. So it's east of the Rockies, that was introduced for tomato pollination. There's a mason bee species here. This is Osmia cornifrons that was introduced from Asia as, I think, blueberry and cranberry pollinators. And then the wool carder bee is a European bee that a lot of people will see in their habitats. And those are non-native species that are less important for our protection, but it is also good to know when they're around so we can kind of track their progress and their establishment in our local ecosystems. So we're going to be talking about managed bees mostly tonight. And so when I say the phrase managed bee, that means we are providing a habitat for them. And the most widespread managed bee species is that European honeybee, but there are native species that we can manage as well. And of those, we have our leafcutter bees and our mason bees and sometimes bumblebees. But it's important to note that when you're providing habitats or when you're kind of inserting yourself into their ecosystems or into their life cycles, there is a little bit more responsibility and care that has to go into it. It's not so much providing just a natural habitat for them when we're putting up an intentional structure like this. And there are ways to provide wildlife habitat and things like that on your property, but managing bees is a little bit of a different beast. And so just know that there are going to be some upkeep things that you'll have to do to make sure that these bees are healthy. All right. And so the managed bees that we'll be talking about tonight are going to be leafcutter bees specifically, and they'll nest in tunnels that you can place into bee houses that are often commercially available and becoming a lot more popular these days. But there are other species that will nest in tunnels like that as well. And so those will be mason bees are probably the most popular, but sometimes you'll see small carpenter bees, sometimes you'll see wool carder bees, sometimes you'll see resin bees, and sometimes you'll have true natives that will incorporate themselves into your managed habitats as well. Okay. And in the case of leafcutter bees, they form these tunnel nests. So they'll find holes that are about 6 millimeters in diameter and about 6 inches deep. And this is where a female will provision little sections or little chambers for her offspring that will develop through the rest of the year. And in the case of leafcutter bees, they became popular for managing because they are solitary, gentle bees that are fun to interact with. So fun and kind of a human culture thing is one aspect of urban and suburban solitary bee houses or maintaining solitary bee houses. They're very low maintenance. So you will have some responsibility to monitor them for their health, but they are very, very easy to care for. And probably the biggest reason that people are interested in managing leafcutter bees or providing habitat for them is because they're really incredible pollinators, and particularly for summer gardens. So if you have melons or squash or peas or beans, and then lots of late blooming native wildflowers will be really benefited by their presence. Okay, and so now we'll get into talking about their life cycle, which should begin in mid to late June, depending on temperatures. We've had kind of a warm year already, with the exception of today, it looks like, but uh, I would expect to start seeing them by the middle of June this year when temperatures are consistently getting close to 80 every day. But first, the males are going to start emerging to start their life cycle right when those temperatures are around 80 degrees every day. And then they'll come out and they'll forage. And so they'll find flowers to grab nectar from, get a little bit of energy. They'll fly back. And then sometimes they'll find a little cozy spot to wait for the females to start emerging. And then once those females emerge, those males don't waste any time. They'll mate. And then as soon as that task is done, they will die. And so from that point on, it's going to be a female dominated world. And those mated females will find a whole nest or a tunnel nest to start managing to rear her offspring. And so those mated females will find flowers that are blooming during the time that they're active, and they'll gather pollen and nectar. And so they'll bring that pollen back to their nest. They've got these long pollen collecting hairs on the undersides of their abdomens, and those pollen collecting hairs are called scopae. But often one of the key signifiers for a leafcutter bee or a bee in the family Megacylidae, which is where they're from, is going to be entirely pollen colored or pollen covered bellies. And so having that bright yellow underside of the abdomen that is just full of pollen grains is going to be a really good signifier of a leafcutter bee if you happen across one out in the wild. And so she'll bring that back to the nest and she'll groom that pollen off of those long hairs on the underside of her abdomen. She'll mix it with a little bit of that nectar and make kind of a sticky ball of bee bread or a loaf, a little pollen loaf that she will then lay an egg on. And at the back of the nest, she's going to be laying fertilized eggs, and those eggs will be the ones that become female. As we may have noticed here in this previous picture, the male bees were emerging kind of from the front of the tunnel, and then the female bees were toward the back of the tunnel. And so generally, that mated female is going to be laying fertilized eggs to develop into a female bee next year. And females are a little bit more robust in body, so they need a little bit more food and then a little bit more time to develop. And so they're placed a little bit further back in that tunnel. And then when she's laid that egg on that pollen ball, she will go out and trim little leaf circles or petal circles to bring back to the nest. And that's what she'll line those little cells with. And so she'll basically carry little circles of petals or leaves with her front legs, bring it back to the nest, and then kind of stuff it and line it around the area where her egg was just laid. And that will seal that section off from the subsequent egg layings that will occur. And so she'll do this usually about 3 females in the back and 3 males in the front if you've got about a 6-inch long tunnel. And then she'll plug up that entire front part of the tunnel with leaf cuttings or with petal cuttings. And then those eggs will actually hatch on that pollen ball. And then they'll, as they're hatching and becoming their little larval, their little grub form, they'll eat all of that pollen that was left behind by their mother. And then they'll go through a pupation phase. And so just like butterflies and beetles and flies, bees are what we call holometabolists, which means they go through a complete metamorphosis from their juvenile to adult phase. And so they have that kind of transitional period of pupation. And so they'll pupate inside of that little chamber, and they'll actually use the leaf cuttings that were left behind by their mother to make a little cocoon for themselves. And so they'll pupate in this leaf cutting cocoon that was left by their mothers. And then there are a couple different things that might happen at this point. So leaf cutters are what we call bivoltine. And so if you're familiar with mason bees, this is where things kind of diverge a little bit. Mason bees are pretty cut and dry, where you'll just have one generation in one season, and then they'll leave the next generation to hibernate through the winter. That will come out in the spring next year. Whereas with leaf cutters, they'll have some that will develop really quickly, and they'll become adults in the same season. And then there's a whole other set of bees that will enter what we call diapause. And so that diapause is where they'll kind of go into a pre-pupa. So they'll get really large and grub, they'll get to their largest grub form, and then they'll slow down so much that they're basically pausing until it gets warm again next season in order to pupate. And so what researchers have found is that the fast developing leaf cutting bees are the ones that are fed less food. And so if they don't have as high of a quality or as much quantity of pollen left behind by their mothers, they'll go through a very rapid development phase, and they'll often be smaller in body at the end. And so they'll very quickly eat through all of the food left behind by their mothers. They'll pupate right away. And then before the season is even over, there'll be adults that are chewing their way out of their cocoons and coming out into the general population of that same season as their mothers. And so most of the time, the second gen bees in the same year will disperse. And so they'll go out and they'll find a new nesting site to take over. Whereas the ones that are fed more food and have longer development times will stick around. And so those bees will actually be left behind developing inside of their tubes that whole rest of the year. And so they won't come out until next summer, when those temperatures are above about 80 degrees every day. Okay. So this aspect of their life history has made them a little bit more challenging to work with as managed bees. And so since they tend to disperse, they'll limit the growth of the population in the area of release. And in the case that these are used for agricultural pollination or in a larger scale husbandry, this makes them a little bit trickier to keep around. And in the case for hobbyists, if you're seeing a lot of your bees disperse and you're not holding on to as much of a population in your habitat, that can, one, be a little bit discouraging, but it can also be a sign that they're not, they don't have enough food in their area. They don't have enough pollen resource in their area to really encourage them to go through this larger development stage where they'll go through diapause and then overwinter into the next year. Okay. So leafcutter bees, as I mentioned, are super amazing pollinators. In this group, Megachilidae, where they come from, they are about 95% effective at pollination. And so that means 95 out of every 100 flowers that they visit, they are effectively transferring pollen so that plant can produce a seed. And in the case of fruit-bearing plants, fruit. And they were really, really popularized as agricultural pollinators for alfalfa. And so alfalfa used to, about 100 years ago, it used to be open pollinated. And so before alfalfa fields were so large that it was the only plant in the area, they had a lot of wild bees or native bees in the area that would provide alfalfa pollination services for free. And so it wasn't until they increased the size of alfalfa fields for an increased demand in beef that they started seeing a huge drop in the production of alfalfa seed, which was really crucial for those alfalfa farmers to produce enough to support the cattle raising industry. So they tried to bring in honeybees, or the main workhorse. And this was around, I would say, the late 1940s and 1950s. And so they brought honeybees in to pollinate alfalfa and didn't see any kind of dramatic increase in seed set from when they were having really dismal results. And the reason for that, they learned, is that honeybees would learn to bypass the pollination mechanism of an alfalfa flower. So an alfalfa flower requires that the bee land on this petal. It's kind of fused. And so it has this keel-like structure that will open up as the bee lands on it. It needs to be a heavy-bodied bee. It will need to land on it. And then the anthers of the flower will stick out and tap them on the backs. And so honeybees learned how to kind of get around this or bypass it in order to gather nectar, and they weren't actually transferring any pollen as they were visiting these flowers. And so these alfalfa growers started to raise alfalfa leafcutter bees because they have these robust bodies. So they were able to trip that natural pollination mechanism by moving that petal down and having the anther come and tap them on the back to move that pollen between flowers. And they didn't seem to mind being tapped on the back so much like honeybees did. And so they never learned to bypass that mechanism. And so leafcutter bees started being reared and managed in larger quantities. And so that's kind of the history of it. And now we can use leafcutter bees for summer pollination of a lot of crops and a lot of gardens and in urban areas to pollinate our native wildflowers that are blooming later in the season when they're active. Okay, so next we'll talk about preparing habitat. And so when we're talking about habitat, the first consideration is really going to be your nesting material. And so in the wild, a leaf cutting bee would find holes in wood. And so that might be a woodpecker hole or holes bored by beetles or other detritivores, and often in fallen wood or in dead wood. Or they might find hollow reeds. And so a lot of woody stemmed or cane plants like caneberries, like raspberries, they'll have a natural hollow opening in that kind of pithy stem. And some bees will nest in that. In the case of leafcutter bees, it needs to be about 6 millimeters in diameter. So that's more likely going to be something like a lake reed. And so those can be harvested and used in bee houses or in bee hotels for your leafcutter bees to nest in. And they have kind of a nice outside texture. It's a little bit of a tactile experience. So when the bee comes back to the nest, if there's a variety of materials or a variety of nests in the same enclosure, they can find that theirs relatively easily by touching the outsides and being able to find their tunnel. I will say when working with natural reeds, those ones tend to be slightly more difficult to open up when you're doing harvests, but it's not terribly difficult kind of once you learn the action of doing it. So it's not really even too huge of a consideration. It just often takes a little bit more strength than you're used to providing. And then cardboard is another suitable material. And so there are manufacturers that make cardboard tubes that are like a paper towel or a paper towel tube or a toilet paper holder. And those they'll be closed off at the back and they'll be about 6 millimeters in diameter. And those are largely available from solitary bee manufacturers. So that would be places like Crown Bees up in Seattle. And there are other custom cardboard places that will fill orders like that. And so you'll see them often marketed as leafcutter bee tubes or summer bee tubes. And those will largely be available at nurseries and online and things like that. And I'm happy to provide resources or referrals to suppliers for things like that. But then my favorite use for solitary bee habitat, or my favorite type of nesting material, is this nesting block. And so basically these are trays that will fit together and can open up and they have little grooves in them. And so the bees will nest in these just as they would with any other tunnel, but when it comes time to clean them or to harvest the cocoons, it's very easy just to open them, clean them out, and then it's also reusable. And so that takes a lot of the pain in the neck out of harvesting and also saves you nesting material so you don't have to replace them every year. And then as far as sizing goes, I've mentioned 6 millimeters. That's kind of the blanket diameter for the most commonly managed leafcutter bees, which are mostly going to be alfalfa leafcutter bees. But there are tons of leafcutter bee species, and all of them are going to have kind of slightly different preferences for the diameter of the hole that they nest in. And so if you are to provide kind of a range of diameter sizes, all kind of around that 6 millimeters, so even all the way down to a 4 millimeter and up to like a 7 or 8, you will house a lot more variety of leafcutter bee species in that one habitat. And you might also see things like resin bees and wool carder bees, or things that aren't necessarily easily managed, but you will kind of be providing a natural habitat mixed in with your managed bees, and that can be really great. Okay. So once you have your nesting materials picked, you'll need a type of enclosure, something to hold them, or a type of bee house. And so generally what we recommend is having something where your tubes can nest all the way in the back and then have a little bit extending, about an inch extending out forward. As you can see here, this particular set of nesting materials is kind of jutting out from the front of that house a little bit, which exposes it to water, and you can see that they're kind of degrading a little bit. And so just something that can nest your tubes all the way in the back end. So having something that's about 7 inches deep for your 6-inch long nesting materials. Some people will drill holes in wood. This is totally fine to do. You can even drill holes in downed logs in your yard, and those will attract wild bees, and you will have wild bees there, but they can't be managed. And so I wouldn't populate them. I wouldn't get bees to put in your nesting blocks. And if you are looking to have a larger scale pollination block where you're housing a lot of bees to come out and provide a lot of pollination services, you'll really need to have some type of tube that you can open. And so if you're just providing wild habitat for wild bee species on a smaller scale in your yard, drilling holes is totally fine. But in the case like this, you have lots of holes side by side that are all drilled. And so you're encouraging a huge population or a denser population of these bees all nesting in one area than they otherwise would in a natural environment. And so that can lead to a very big buildup of pests and disease that can wipe out your populations over time. And so that's not something that we generally will recommend. Okay. Here's some more examples of mixing and matching with your bee houses. This is at our farm on Savi Island, or the farm that we work out of. And this is all made with reclaimed wood and materials that were used in our honeybee hives. And so it's all kind of just been repurposed and nailed together or staple gunned together and then painted. So really you can get kind of creative with the materials that you use to build your enclosures. And then you can also intersperse or mix and match the types of nesting materials that you have all in the same enclosure. And so you can use a variety of tube diameters. You can use a variety of types of nesting materials. So you can use cardboard and natural reeds and nesting blocks all in the same area. And you can even have some logs interspersed into your larger bee habitats or into your larger bee houses for wild bees to find and move into that you won't necessarily be managing. And then having a variety of natural materials in your houses can also help your bees orient and give them kind of a more natural feel that will attract more wild bees in. and will help them find and locate their particular nesting site so they're not going into, their neighbor's house all the time. All right. And if you're looking for inspiration on a DIY project for bee houses, I highly recommend going on social media and then searching for hashtag bee house. There are a lot of really creative bee houses out there that people have put together. And this, yeah, it can be just really, really great inspiration and provide a lot of awesome ideas. All right. So there are a couple of rules or things that you will need to follow when creating your own habitat, but then also when purchasing. So I wouldn't kind of impulse purchase a bee house that you see, at Costco or Walmart or on Amazon or anything like that, because a lot of them just simply aren't viable. And so as I mentioned earlier, your houses need to be at least 7 inches deep to include your 6-inch long nesting materials. And so a lot of these houses or bee houses or bee hotels that are most commonly commercially available are very shallow. And so those aren't going to be viable nesting sites for bees. You may see spiders or beetles or paper wasps or other things kind of move into here, which is awesome because those can be beneficial invertebrates to provide habitat for in garden spaces as well. But I wouldn't expect to maintain a bee population in any of these. And then something else to consider, if you live in a place with a lot of bird activity or squirrel activity, you can put hardware cloth over the front of your house to protect your nesting materials. And so that is like chicken wire, and that it has kind of a larger gauge, something large enough that birds can't get into it, and I'm sorry, small enough that birds can't get into it, and then large enough that your bees can freely move in and out as they're entering and exiting their nesting materials. All right. Here's a couple more examples of bad bee houses that you will commonly see, and just that I would caution against. And then as far as other habitat requirements, there are best places to hang them. And so often the best place is just going to be on your house side, especially if you have south or southeast facing house side that has a little bit of rain and wind protection, just mounting it there. Otherwise, you can mount it on a post, you can mount it in a tree, you can get really creative with how you mount leafcutter bee houses. But we do definitely recommend having sun exposure early in the morning. So having it pointing south or southeast, so the fronts of those tubes or those nesting materials will get those morning rays, and that'll warm up your female leafcutter bees so that they can go in earlier on in the day and fly to gather resources. And then they'll need all of their forage and nesting materials within about a 300-foot radius of the house, so in all directions. And so that's just going to be a variety of blooming plants that are blooming when they're active. And so I mentioned that'll be, late June and through the summer when it's really warm is when they'll be foraging. And so having those late blooming, those mid-season and then late blooming flowers is going to be really important for them to be able to gather enough nectar and pollen. And then I definitely recommend mounting your houses at least 6 feet off the ground to prevent ground moisture from getting in, but then also to prevent predatory wasps or scavenging wasps that are kind of closer to the ground from finding those nesting sites and finding those nesting locations. So mounting it up a little bit higher is going to provide some protection as well. And then as far as leaves, so the nesting materials that they'll need will also need to be within that 300-foot radius all around that house. And so the leaves themselves are from kind of a variety of plants that have a similar consistency to a rose petal, but they'll gather leaf cutouts from roses and dahlias and lilac, peas, beans, berries. And so a lot of leafcutter bees will really enjoy raspberries. Or marionberries, but it looks really, really cool. And this is something I definitely recommend watching out for in your yards is your leaf cutting bees actually collecting their nesting materials. And so they'll kind of they'll land on the edge of the leaf itself, and then they'll use their great big mandibles. So one of the features or one of the hallmarks of the bees in the family Megachilidae is that they have these really pronounced mandibles for gathering nesting materials. And in the case of mason bees, that'll be scooping up mud. But then for leafcutter bees, it's to kind of chew out these little half circles or semicircles of petals. And so they'll grab onto the edge and then they'll use their mandibles and kind of run in a semicircle along the edge of that petal to cut out their leaf cutting. And so that's what they'll bring back to the nest and line their little brood cells for their developing young. And so a lot of times these signs of wear can be seen as pest behavior. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. If you're providing habitat and you're trying to support leaf cutting bees, if you're seeing those chew marks in leaves themselves, it's not a pest, it's actually your beneficial insect. And just kind of knowing that you had a leaf cutter bee there doing what she does best is important to know, so that you're not sorry, let me start over. So a lot of people will see those chew marks and assume that there are pests present, and then will use some kind of pest control method. And those pest control methods will often be detrimental to the bee's health as well. And so that's just something to keep in mind. If you see these chew marks, it's actually a good sign that you have a happy and healthy leaf cutting bee population in your area. And it's really, really cool to see. They'll cut it out and then they kind of clumsily will fly away holding it in their front legs. And it definitely looks like they've been encumbered. And so they'll kind of bump into things and kind of wobble around a little bit as they're adjusting to the weight of carrying that leaf back to their nest. And so it's just fun to watch. So I would definitely recommend, setting up a viewing area near your houses to see them coming back with their leaf cutouts. It's pretty fun. Okay, and then as far as blooms for leafcutter bees, these are some of our favorites or ones that we've noticed they'll go to a lot. And so there are a lot of leaf cutting bee species that will specialize to flowers in the aster family. So I have a ton of Douglas aster in my yard, and leaf cutting bees really love that, and I can't recommend that plant more. And then Nootka rose is really popular, or gumweed or goldenrod, but they'll also gather nectar and pollen from weeds like clovers or dandelion. But also, if you can provide some kind of cover crop or ground cover for your leaf cutting bees that will bloom later in the season, like a crimson clover or a buckwheat, those can also be really helpful to your leaf cutting bee population. And then, of course, we recommend using pesticide-free plants if possible. If you're getting starts and seeds that haven't been treated with systemic pesticides like neonicotinoids, that's going to provide the healthiest and best resource for your bees. Neonicotinoids will be taken up into all of the plant tissue. So usually the seeds are treated or the starts are treated, and then that pesticide is going to be in all of those plants' tissues for the rest of that plant's life. And so that includes the nectar and the pollen. And so it's really important to make sure that you're getting things that haven't been treated. And so making sure that you're checking in with the nurseries that you're purchasing from is really important. If you're looking for seed mixes, I recently discovered that the Oregon Bee Atlas, based out of Oregon State University Extension, provides a lot of seed packets. And so they'll have clover mixes that are really good for providing that ground cover, providing an abundant resource throughout the season. But then they also have perennials that will seeds for perennials that will need a little bit more loving care, so needing to be planted in the fall and things like that. But yeah, those are great resources. And so I definitely, if you're in the market for bee seeds, I would check out the Oregon Bee Atlas. Otherwise, if you need help knowing what to plant, I always recommend the Xerces Society plant lists. They have one for the Maritime Northwest, and here's a link to that here. But then also Metro has a native plant guide for the Willamette Valley. That's really helpful. And there's a meadowscaping handbook, I think from West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. That's also really helpful. So those are resources that we can share with you and will be provided. And so at the farm on Sauvie Island, we do have kind of a meadowscaping project where we have a mix of annuals and perennials that eventually should live in full sun without being watered. And so the plants that I have highlighted on this list are the ones that are blooming at the same time that leaf cutting bees are active. And so if you're looking for something specifically for leaf cutting bees, these might be really great options. Otherwise, if you're looking just to create a pollinator seed mix or something that you can seed in the fall, we used the NRCS and USDA guidelines with, there was a study from Oregon State partnered with the NRCS and the USDA that looked at the quality of different pollinator seed mixes, and then they were looking at which ones thrived the best. And so there's a plant guide from them to help people create their own seed mixes that would suit their own environments. And so that resource is really, really helpful. But if you do have a place that's a little bit drier and in full sun, we've found this particular mix to be good and suitable and to provide blooms. So far, we're on our third year after planting, and we're starting to see more and more of those longer lived perennials starting to bloom and actually having more robust plants. And so it's something that's worked really well for us, and I can recommend it. Okay. So providing a lot of resources and putting up the habitats and having just in general a really cushy environment for them can often be enough to gather or to kind of draw in wild leaf cutting bees or bees that are already naturally living in your area. But if you're looking to have a really good year, your first year where you want to have better summer garden pollination, or if you have a crop that requires a better pollinator like a leaf cutting bee that blooms later in the season, you may need to look into populating your habitats. And so that would require adding cocoons. And so these cocoons are often available from different bee breeders. And the one that I would recommend the most is going to be Watt's solitary bees. They are in southern Washington, but they have a huge amount of leaf cutting bees and leaf cutting bee cocoons available. And so that's where I would go first if you're releasing leaf cutting bees into your habitats. Otherwise, there are places like Crown Bees in Seattle that will have leaf cutting bees available in the summer. And so when you're actually releasing your cocoons, what I'd recommend is placing them just on top of your nesting materials and then all the way back in the habitat. Some of the designs for bee hotels will have these attic spaces in the top, and you can place your cocoons, just kind of slide them all the way into the back of that attic space, or you could do it just right on top of the nesting materials. And then once those bees warm up enough, that will stir them out to chew their way out of their cocoons and to colonize the nesting sites. All right, so for those of you who are already familiar with mason bees, harvesting your cocoons is going to be quite a bit different when it comes to leaf cutter bees. And there's a lot more kind of faith and finger crossing that happens with leafcutter bees, but that's because they have that kind of strange life history strategy where instead of pupating and becoming an adult before going into winter, they're entering diapause. And so they have that pre-pupal larval stage that's going to overwinter. And so it's in a little bit more of a vulnerable life stage. And so we can't actually open up those materials and remove those cocoons at that time because it would damage those larvae before they pupate, which can be bad. And so when you notice that your tubes are sealed off with leaf cuttings, and so you can see that that leafy material is completely packed all the way to the front of the tube, you can remove those tubes and place them in some kind of a mesh bag. And so we often will get these drawstring organza bags that will move all of the nesting tubes into. And then, or you can use something like a nylon or a pillowcase or anything like that. But then you'll need to store it through the cold season somewhere with cool ambient temperature. So that could be like a garage or a basement or a shed, but it needs to be somewhat ambient and then in that protective sac so things aren't able to get in and predate on it. And so you don't have anything that's going into the refrigerator in the case of leaf cutting bees, but you'll store it at ambient temperature through that cold season. And something that we do recommend when you're pulling these nesting materials out, you can always uninstall your entire bee house or your bee hotel and store that through the cold season as well to kind of extend its shelf life. Okay. So harvesting your cocoons is actually going to take place in the spring. And so you're not going to be storing cocoons through the winter. You're storing your tubes, you're storing your nesting materials. And then come spring, so April, is when you'll actually open up these nesting materials and remove the cocoons. And that also looks a bit different for your leaf cutting bees because they're using the nesting materials as their cocoons. So when you open up those tubes or those trays, you're just going to have kind of a long stack of cocoons side by side in their little plant casings. And so you can basically separate those off, remove any extra debris or anything that's around, and then keep an eye out for parasitic wasps. And so there's going to be similar parasitic wasps to mason bees. So the Pteromalus parasitic wasps are going to have these little grubs. And so that'll be a sign that you need to remove those. Also, pinholing in the outsides of the nesting materials can be a sign that you had parasitic wasps lay eggs in there and that they've been eating that leafcutter bee. So just making sure that you're separating all of that out and then freezing it for about a 48-hour period before discarding will keep those parasitic wasps from overpopulating. Okay, so once you have your cocoons removed from the debris and separated and removed from their nesting materials, you can store it in a breathable sack or like a cardboard box somewhere at ambient temperatures inside your house. And so it'll need to be pretty warm. So you can put them in kind of a warm, dark place in your house inside of that sack or inside of a little bit of a box. I definitely recommend using something like an organza bag that you can kind of see through because what you might see is first you'll see that the parasitic wasps will pupate and they'll start emerging as adults. And so you can see them come out into that kind of meshy bag and you can just kind of pinch them to keep them from re-entering the population. But then also, you'll keep an eye on those bags to see when your male leafcutter bees start emerging. And so generally this is, I think the guideline is when temperatures are consistently 75, but usually what I've seen is they'll come out when it's even warmer than that, so around 80. But then you can keep an eye out for when those temperatures start really warming up for those male bees to start emerging from their cocoons and to be crawling around inside of that mesh bag. And so having that kind of visual cue can help you know when to move your cocoons out to their habitats. And so once you see those males first start emerging, you can move the whole bag of cocoons to your habitat, put them on top of your nesting materials, and then they'll all start emerging. Okay. And so in general, this will be your seasonal outline for managing solitary bees. So usually January through March is going to be your research phase and looking at suppliers and finding houses and possible nest locations and things like that, setting up your nesting sites. And then your spring bees are going to be your mason bees that will be nesting in those habitats. And then just even in the same habitat, come summertime, you'll have your leafcutter bee population starting to take over those habitats. And they can coexist. So you can keep both mason bees and leafcutter bees in the same enclosures. You'll just swap out the nesting materials and they'll be active at different stages of the season. And so they're not going to be really competing for anything inside of that habitat. So leafcutter bees will begin nesting as early as the middle of June, but generally they're accepted. Active season will start in July and it will go through September. And so just for the rest of that really warm season. Okay, and then for winter, of course, we'll move those finished or those capped tubes into their bags for storage and keep them at ambient temperatures before incubating your leafcutter bees, or starting incubating them in spring after harvesting the cocoons in April. Okay. So now we should have a good amount of time for questions.
Absolutely. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and keep on putting them in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let's start with one that came through our registration for the webinar. And you already touched base on it, but I just want to make sure to get their question read. So the question is in regards to housing leafcutter bees and mason bees. Is it possible to use the same bee houses to host both species? And is there a better option to host leafcutter bees rather than in the same houses as mason bee houses?
Yeah. So you absolutely can have mason bees and leafcutter bees in the same habitat. They won't be active at the same times, and they have preferences for different nesting materials. And so leafcutter bees like smaller nesting holes than mason bees. And so if you're putting a variety of tube sizes just from the start, so if you get what's kind of known as a pollinator set, where you're getting just a bundle of nesting materials that are, a mixture of cardboard and reeds that have a lot of different diameters, all the way from like 8 millimeters down to 2 millimeters, and putting all of those into the same enclosure, you're going to attract a huge variety of bees. They might not all be active at the same time, but they won't necessarily be competing for resources or anything. And it's totally fine to keep them side by side.
Cool. Awesome. Variety is the spice of life after all.
Yes.
All right, so another question, or a question from tonight. So what does the egg-laying female do to determine the sex of their egg that they laid?
Yeah.
They must be doing this to have the first eggs all be female and then the last eggs to be male.
Yeah, absolutely. So when a female bee mates, she has a specialized organ kind of near her ovaries called a spermatheca. And so that's where she's storing all of that male genetic material. And she can essentially choose when to fertilize the egg that she's laying with that male genetic material as she's laying it, or right before she lays it. And so this actually has been a widely or less researched topic. What they've found is that it has a lot to do with the cue of how far back in the tube she is. And so if she's traveling a far distance from the entrance of her tube still to get toward the back, then she will choose to lay a female egg. It also can depend on the amount of resources that are available. So, if pollen is scarce and, she's only laid a couple of female eggs, she may choose to switch to laying a bunch of male eggs because those males will spread her genetics along to the next emerging population. And so she'll give them less food, and they'll develop a little bit more quickly. And it can kind of just be a last ditch effort for spreading genetics when resources are scarce in the environment. But generally speaking, it's going to be a tube depth. And so there were these studies that were happening that I actually haven't followed up on in a long time, but they were using really, really deep tubes to get leafcutter bees to lay more female eggs. And they found that that was occurring. And so she can kind of at will choose whether to lay a fertilized or unfertilized egg, but it's due to kind of a lot of environmental factors. And it seems to be that how far back in the tube she's laying is going to be one of the larger triggers of whether she lays a fertilized or unfertilized egg.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
That'd be a cool study to follow up on.
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
I'll try to find it and keep you guys up to date on it.
yeah, that'd be great. So another question from this evening, are kleptoparasites a management issue when it comes to leafcutter bees?
Yes. So it's a little bit less so than with mason bees because Houdini flies really don't bother leafcutter bees like they do with masons yet. And so really the ones that you're going to be battling most are going to be parasitoids. And so that's going to be wasps that are laying eggs that will devour the bee larva rather than stealing its pollen or stealing its food. But there will be things like pollen mites present in leafcutter bee habitats as well, which could be considered kleptoparasites, but it's not as huge of an issue as with Houdini flies and mason bees. And then as far as managing those parasitic wasps, really the best thing to do when you're pulling out your leafcutter bee cocoons is just to keep an eye out for that pinholing on the outsides of your nesting materials, looking for their larvae, and then keeping them in the mesh bag and then just like squishing them as soon as they emerge, because they tend to emerge earlier than your male leafcutter bees.
Super cool. All right, well, that's the only questions that we have thus far for this evening. So if anyone has any last minute questions, please feel free to go ahead and add them in the chat or into the Q&A box. Oh, and just as I speak,
Cool.
Great, good timing. So another question is, will the bees hatch and survive on their own if the bee houses are left outside, or do they rely on being brought inside during the cold season to complete their life cycle?
Great question. And so there are wild leafcutter bee populations that survive without any kind of management. However, when we're providing these habitats that have, a dense aggregation of these nests all in one location, the main concern is breeding ground for parasitic wasps and pollen mites and things like that. And so that's generally why we recommend bringing them in. Also bringing them in for overwintering, like you can leave them in their house locations through the winter, just in their normal natural temperatures, and then still harvest your cocoons in the spring to get rid of your parasites and your pollen mites and things like that. But the added advantage is that you're protecting from wind and water and any molds that would grow on them as a result of that. And then also any kind of predation that might happen over the winter, things finding your overwintering bees in their houses. And so it's just kind of an added protection to maintain your populations. And so I would expect that if you're just kind of leaving them out, that you'll, sustain some loss in your bee population. But then, of course, harvesting and that main concern is parasitic wasp population explosion. And so that's why we'd recommend harvesting them, but it occurs just at a later time. Sorry, does that make sense?
Totally makes sense.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so a question not about leafcutter bees, but about mason bees,
Sure.
which they're one and the same, more or less. So where should folks keep their mason bees over the summer, indoors or outdoors?
Great question. So your mason bees should at this point be wrapped up, and you'll see that kind of mud plug at the front of the tube. You can remove those tubes and store them at ambient temperatures like you would with a leafcutter bee through the winter, but it would just occur through the summer. And so you can put them into an enclosed bag or something to protect them from parasitic wasps and Houdini flies and things like that. Or you can just leave them in the habitat until October when it's time to harvest them. And so it's a similar choice. It just occurs earlier than with leaf cutting bees. And so you can pull them now and then store them somewhere where it's warm and then inside of like a protective bag. Or you can leave them. So it's up to you.
Yeah, and really when you're talking about kind of the ambient temperature, what's about kind of that temperature that you're looking for?
Yeah, so I would I would go within a range of 10 degrees of what it is outside, or what it is measured outside. So that can be, in your home in a window, unless it's, 100 degrees in the window or whatever. But yeah, anything like a shed or a garage or anything that's not really, really overheating should be fine.
Great. That's great advice to have. Awesome. Well, I think that's the last question that we'll have for this evening. But if any questions come along the lines after, if you're thinking back on this presentation, I will CC Rebecca on that follow-up email that we'll be sending to you that will have the recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of the slides that we saw tonight, and link to the Meadowscaping Handbook, as well as the SWCD plant mix that we had spoken about earlier. So
and then also,
yeah,
sorry,
no, please.
To hop in about resources, I did put together a little landing page with the presentation and then some other links to retailers and things like that you can visit as well.
Great. And I can make sure to call out that landing page and put that directly in the email for folks so you can have easy access to it.
Awesome.
So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And if you have any questions for Rebecca or myself, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we're here to help with your leafcutter bee endeavors.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining.
Have a great night, everyone.